Religion always functions best from the margins and not in the councils of power.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in Massachusetts.
Once you begin to crave political power or influence, you lose your prophetic voice. The importance, I think, of faith and religion is to speak from the margins.
Dr. Randall Balmer has been a prophetic voice on the rise of the religious right and the growth of Christian nationalism for many years. A religion historian, author, and college professor, Randall has deep expertise in the ways religion, particularly evangelical Christianity, has been consolidating power in plain sight and what this could lead to this November and in the years ahead. In the past couple of years, I've had the privilege of conducting so many memorable interviews with some of the great thinkers, strategists, and leaders of our time on this state of belief. They have given you and me so much encouragement for living these difficult times. It's a great way to feel less alone. So I want to make sure that you're subscribed to the State of Belief podcast at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Or just visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. That way you'll never miss a conversation. You also have access to almost 100 past interviews with guests like Dr. Anethea Butler, Jeff Charlotte, Bishop William Barber, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Dr. Jamar Tisby, Rob Reiner, and so many others. It would really help us to have you subscribe, rate, and tell people you're close to about all that you're hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you. You're helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest, a prize-winning historian and Emmy Award nominee. Randall Balmer holds the John Phillips Chair in Religion at Dartmouth, the oldest endowed professorship at Dartmouth College. He's also an Episcopal priest. And as early as 1989, he was publishing books like Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into Evangelical Subculture in America, Thy Kingdom Come, How the Religious Right Distorts Faith and Threatens America, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right, and most recently, Saving Faith, How American Christianity Can Reclaim Its Prophetic Voice. Randall, congratulations on receiving the 2024 American Academy of Religion Martin E. Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion. It's so great to have you back on the State of Belief.
Thank you, Paul. It's good to be here. Nice to talk with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this list of titles shows that you are not new to this game of actually looking at religion in America and kind of raising the flag and saying, hey, pay attention. What's going on in American religion is actually really important and can impact our public life together. So maybe can you just take us back to a little bit about your history and how you came to really recognize what was happening in America, especially on the religious right way back, but what in you made your eyes open to that?
Wow, what a question. I guess the deep answer to that question is that I grew up as an evangelical. My father was a minister for 40 years in the Evangelical Free Church. And I hasten to add that I honor both his memory and his ministry. So growing up in that world and what I came later as a scholar to call the evangelical subculture was utterly formative to me. And evangelicalism is part of my DNA. I try to run away from it sometimes, and believe me, in the last few years, I've really tried to run away from it, but it's part of who I am. And I think as I became a scholar, first of all, I went to graduate school really to be a historian of colonial America. And I kind of stumbled into doing scholarship on evangelicalism rather haphazardly during my time at Columbia University. But as I came to that study, that is the looking at the history of evangelicalism and seeing the emergence of the religious right, I began to see this great disconnect between the history of the movement that had shaped me so profoundly and the current iteration of its political sensibilities with religious right.
What I love about that, and I just find myself talking to a lot of people who with similar profiles who really come out of that movement and who owe a lot of their, some of the underlying religious sensibilities to that movement, and who often see beauty in that movement and are grateful for certain parts of it. And I love that, because I think the important recognition is that this is not a condemnation. When we raise up questions about a tradition's use of religion in the public square and how it's manifesting, it's not necessarily, although sometimes it can include, a condemnation of a tradition that has been so rich and that has been so meaningful for individuals personally, and also how they, evolved as citizens of this country. So I love that background. I'm wondering if you start to look back even at your father's ministry, and this is not a chance for you to denigrate at all your father, but when you look back with these eyes that you gained once you started being a scholar of religion, did you see signs, like even in the 70s, or where, it's not entirely surprising that this evolution happened? Already we were seeing inklings of this. With your scholarship eye, can you go back even that far in your own experience and recognize moments that might have indicated something like this?
I guess I did see, maybe in retrospect, where it was heading. And but at the time, I saw things very, very differently. I remember, for example, when I went off to college, I went to a little school called Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois, which was my denominational school, which sadly closed last year. It's really a great tragedy in my judgment, because it was such a formative place for me. But I remember as a first-year student there in the fall of 1972, gives you some idea how old I am, kind of pleading with my classmates, we Christians, I didn't know any other real term to describe us. I realize now we're talking about evangelical Christians, but we Christians need to be involved in politics. We need to be active in the political arena. And it fell on deaf ears. There was just no interest whatsoever in that. And so the great irony of my life and my career, I suppose, beginning in the 1970s, is that I was advocating for political engagement because I was fairly confident that, albeit naively so as I understand now, I was fairly confident that if evangelicals became involved or re-engaged in social issues, they would do so in a way that their ancestors, their political or their religious forebears had in the 19th century. That is to say, to work for the benefit of those Jesus called the least of these. And particularly as I began to study a bit more about my own tradition, I saw that evangelicals were very involved in issues like prison reform. They were staunch advocates of public education, known as common schools in the 19th century, because, and they were explicit about this, this was a way to advance the fortunes of those who were on the lower rungs of society. They were very involved in peace movements. I've even run across an instance of a gun control movement sponsored by evangelicals in the antebellum period. And they were very much in favor of women's equality, including equal rights and voting rights, which in the 19th century was a radical idea. So as I was advocating for these things, I was, reasonably confident that should evangelicals begin to become involved in politics in the 1970s, they would surely gravitate to the same issues that had energized and animated evangelicals of an earlier era. Of course, I turned out to be dreadfully wrong.
There's a history, and also like where evangelicals meet what we understood as like the mainline church or kind of the, modernist church, that, my
Your
forebearers
people.
were a
Yeah.
part of. Yeah. But,
Sure.
Walter Rauschenbusch's father was a hardcore evangelical, but he was also the one who, when he started a church in Missouri, said, there will be no slave owners that will ever enter this church. His condemnation of slavery, and he condemned the North and the South both. I mean, he was like not a great guy in many ways, but in some, because he was really, really focused on sin. But he really, when he focused on sin and he saw slavery as a sin, which he did primarily, he called it out. And so there is like this really interesting tradition within evangelical taking on issues. And then I actually think it's very funny that you went into the 70s, because that's really when, we had the rise of what, was conveniently called the moral majority, and then, into the religious right, and then the Christian coalition. I want to jump to our current era and ask you like the $1 million question. It's, I guess, within, it's possible it's $1 billion question today. Did you see this coming? Like, did you see this, like what was happening 70s, 80s, 90s? Because it was always there. I mean, this like rise of the what we used to call the religious right or the Christian right or the Christian coalition, to this sort of moment where Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism is at such a height and such a force. And so tell me about like how you understand our current moment, given that you've been writing about this literally for 30 years.
Yeah, I have to say I was kind of blindsided by it, Paul. Particularly 2016, when the figure came out that 81% of white evangelicals voted for a thrice married former casino operator and self-confessed sexual predator for president. This is the movement that was trumpeting its so-called family values. I was blindsided by that, I have to say. But again, as I sat down to write Bad Faith, which is about, as you know, about the origins of the religious right, it allowed me to kind of, again, look through the historical tea leaves and say, well, wait a minute, this probably isn't all that surprising. As you know, within Bad Faith, what I demonstrate, I think without any doubt, I'm happy to stand on this with anybody who wants to challenge me, is that the religious right did not galvanized as a political movement in the 1970s in opposition to abortion. I mean, it's just utter fiction. And I call it the abortion myth. What drew it together as a political movement was a defense of racial segregation at places like Bob Jones University, but also segregation academies like Jerry Falwell's Liberty Christian Academy that he formed in 1967, explicitly to keep students of color out of his school and also to keep white students out of the desegregated public school system. I mean, it's very clear about that.
I think it's worth mentioning, like, this is meant as a compliment. It's not meant to diminish your scholarship contribution, but it is one of those things that when I read that book and I read your really flawless academic scholarship on it, it did help me change the narrative completely. Because I think the very convenient one was like, oh, they rallied around abortion. And that was really what everybody said, even the people on the left and the right. But it wasn't true. And it was really your scholarship for me. I mean, I think there may have been other people who were aware of it at the time at a personal level, but to elevate it to the level of kind of really undisputed fact at this point that the religious right was really founded, it's the movement that we know of today, on the idea of almost as a reaction to Brown v. Board of Education and the idea of school integration.
And there's no question about that. I mean, it's again, the book, as you know, is flooded with footnotes, and anybody who wants to go back.
No, it's really amazing, but it's just that, and so honestly, that's where, if we fast forward to 2016, and we really, like underline white evangelicals, right, rather than evangelicals. I'm sure you saw God and Country, yep, the Rob Reiner, and when Jamar Tisby, who's a very interesting person who
Mhm.
we've had on this show,
Sure.
talked about the moment when he saw that all these evangelicals who he thought were his, siblings in Christ, and he had been hanging out mostly in white evangelical spaces, but when he saw that almost all of them voted for Trump and that there was kind of a racial underlining of that. It's a devastating moment in the film. It was a devastating transitional moment in his own life. But this goes back to that late 60s, early 70s. And I think frankly, I think that the film relies heavily, the God and Country relies heavily on your scholarship to
Yeah.
really underscore that. So, I mean, this is really important for us to remember today because, abortion, I completely disagree with the Christian rights interpretation of that, but there's a way for me to understand it. There's no way for me to understand this lack of ability to understand that we should be a democracy that benefits all people regardless of race, and so, or with regards to race. And so I'd be interested in you talking about how you see that manifesting itself now in the kind of white Christian nationalism that we're seeing.
As I was trying to understand for myself, this, 81% of white evangelicals voting for Trump in 2016, you know, then I went back while I was writing Bad Faith and said, well, wait a minute, let's look at the origins of this movement.
Right.
And
Exactly.
maybe it's no surprise whatsoever. And,
Right.
the image I think I use in the book is that you can have this beautiful structure, but if the foundation is rotten, it's going to be compromised, and that I think describes the religious right. And the other point I want to make as well is that the transitional figure there between Jerry Falwell and the religious right in the late 1970s and Donald Trump in 2016, the transitional figure is Ronald Reagan. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear that because they regard him as a kind of political messiah. But let's consider the evidence. Ronald Reagan got his start in politics in opposition to the Rumford Fair Housing Act in California that sought to guarantee equal access to both rental housing as well as purchase of housing. He was an outspoken opponent of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout his political campaigns, he kept invoking the specter of welfare queens, women of color, supposedly,
Yes, yes,
who were
yes.
living these lives of luxury off the public dole. He also was using the dog whistle of law and order. Of course, Nixon had used it as well, but nevertheless, Reagan was using that. And I think, for me, the clincher in terms of Reagan is, and people don't remember this, but on August 3rd, 1980, he opened his general election campaign for the presidency of all places, and I still can't quite believe it, but he did, in all places, at the Neshoba County Fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the place where 16 summers earlier, members of the Ku Klux Klan, in collusion with the local sheriff's department, abducted, tortured, and killed 3 civil rights workers during
Mm.
Freedom Summer of 1964. And lest anyone miss his meaning, and Reagan was a master of symbolism, he declared to that all-white audience, I believe in states' rights, invoking that
Mm.
age-old
Mm.
segregationist battle cry.
Mm. Wow.
So again,
Yeah.
connecting.
Yeah, connecting. That's really interesting. It makes me think we had Diane Winston on this show
Oh, yeah, sure.
a while ago, and she wrote a book called Writing the American Dream about the
Yes.
evangelical tie-in with Ronald Reagan, which is something I hadn't really focused on, but it was just really, really interesting to hear about that. And this ties into what you're saying, and I think I think one of the things that's important, just to talk about the exercise in power and how important power is, and the sense of I think there's a refrain of we're of white evangelicals or white Christian nationalists, like we are powerless in the face of these incredible forces that are trying to take away our religion, take away our freedoms, when in fact they actually have wielded power in a very calculated way. And I think Donald Trump is a perfect example of that.
Sure, exactly. Yeah. And I'll go on to say that I think power is corrosive, and that's hardly a new observation. I understand that, but particularly for religion, I've
Yeah.
long argued that religion always functions best from the margins and not in the councils of power. Because
Mm,
once you begin to crave political power or influence, you lose your prophetic voice. Now, there are all sorts of
mm,
examples of that, not only with the religious right, but also I'll point out, Paul, and I'm speaking myself as well, in mainline Protestantism, or I sometimes call brand name Protestantism. That
that's
is to
good.
say that in the post-war era in particular, mainline Protestants and the National Council of Churches were riding high.
Yeah.
And what happened was that as they became very acculturated to wielding influence within the culture, I think they began to lose their prophetic voice, and they began
Yeah.
that long slide that we're both aware of, there, where mainline Protestantism or brand name Protestantism is very much on the decline.
Yeah.
So the the importance, I think, of faith and religion is to speak from the margins. And that, I
Mm,
think, has been the great downfall of the religious right, is that beginning with Ronald Reagan, they offered no prophetic voice. I mean, Reagan went on a binge of, tax cuts for the wealthy. We all know about this. We don't need to rehearse the particulars, but where were the dissenting voices at that time? Well, yeah, you have people like Jim Wallace and
yeah.
others who are doing so, but they don't have nearly the megawatts that somebody like Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell had in that era, and they were utterly silent. They were
Mm.
sucking up to power in craven ways that I think ultimately diminished the power of the faith.
Up next, much more with religion historian Randall Balmer. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. Make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is Professor Randall Balmer, author of books like Saving Faith: How American Christianity Can Reclaim Its Prophetic Voice. It's very interesting watching the religion in this current election and how it's being talked about or not being talked about, but also the manifestations of religion. I mean, at the top of the Republican ticket, we do have Donald Trump, who is, it's, the way he, I have to get your take on this crazy thing he said to that group of evangelicals, like really, really right-wing evangelicals. It was like I'm not going to do the invitation, but my beautiful Christians, just vote this one more time. I'm going to fix it. This is, you'll never have to vote again. I mean, those are quotes. I'm not like making this up. I mean, and it was one of those, I was like, what is he saying? How do you interpret that? Because that's like something, again, I think it's like, there was almost a code there being offered. Because, he is very clear that he, that evangelical Christians put him over the top. And and what he said to them even in 2016 was like, I'm the only one who's going to speak for you. No one else cares about you, but they should care about you. And the Christian lobbying group and all of this kind of stuff. But then now again, he's trying to call on that. And what did you think he was saying when he said
Well,
that?
I think everything about Donald Trump has to be interpreted through the lens of his own narcissism. And so I think what he was really saying is that give me a second term, then I'll be off the, I'll fix everything for you, whatever that means. But you won't need to vote again because I'm not going to be on the ballot. That's all he cares about. I mean, he doesn't talk about, he doesn't care about a legacy. He just, it's all about him and his narcissism. But I mean, the statement itself was pretty, as you say, pretty jarring and unfortunate, I think. But I think what he's playing on, and I think there's a part of his brilliance. I don't think he realizes it, but he's kind of stumbled upon it. But I think what he's playing on is this sense of victimization.
Yeah.
And evangelicals and again, as I said earlier, I grew up in this subculture, so I know it very well. Evangelicals have long considered themselves to be victims and to be marginal. And you're right, they no longer are in terms of their political power these days. They're not marginal at all, but they sustain this rhetoric of victimization. And I think one of the reasons they were drawn to Donald Trump is that, frankly, he speaks this rhetoric of victimization better than anyone I've ever heard. It's all about him, of course. He's always the victim. But I think there was something in that vocabulary that resonated with them. And I think that's one of the reasons that they were drawn to him. So when he talks about fixing everything for evangelicals, I mean, he's talking about Christian nationalism, and we can talk more specifically about that. But he's also appealing to their sense of being victimized somehow in this society. Again, it's utterly false. It's no less false, frankly, than the abortion myth in the 1970s. But it's a very effective rallying cry.
Right. Well, how do you define Christian nationalism?
Well, as I understand it, Christian nationalism believes two out of the following three things. One, America was founded as a Christian nation. Two, America is a Christian nation. Or three, America should be a Christian nation. And I think Christian nationalism means believing in two out of those three, or at least two, and some, I'm sure, believe all three. But the shorthand definition, I think, is this notion that America is, and perhaps always has been, a Christian nation, and that, of course, is demonstrably false. And it's a very, very dangerous ideology, it seems to me.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting, like, what they mean by Christian.
Yeah.
Made in their own image. A commie like me or you is definitely not what they mean by America as it's very much their idea of who they are. That's, I think, a really important element, because it's not only, an affront to people of other faiths and people who, adhere to no particular faith tradition, but are every bit as fully American as anyone else.
Sure.
But also to the millions and millions of Christians who don't believe as they do.
Right.
The internal disconnect is stunning, and yet, they really believe that they also, I think the one additional thing I would say is that they want to use the levers of government in order to enforce that vision. And that is, that's the reason they're taking over school boards, and they're taking over, and you have the governor of Oklahoma declaring the whole state for Jesus. And then, of course, his school district leader is now saying that, the Bible has to be taught in schools. And so, it really is not only saying it, but then enacting policies to enforce it in their own image. And that feels.
And it's just, it's a grievous mistake. And I think Christian nationalism is wrong for three reasons. The first is theological. What did Jesus say? My kingdom is not of this world. End of conversation.
Yeah.
Why are we even having this?
And the major temptation that he faced was the devil saying, I'll give it all to you.
Exactly.
I'll give it all to you. And Jesus says, no, thank you. It's one of the most important moments in the whole gospel. The devil says, I'll give you all the kingdoms. You can control everything. And he's like, that's not the way it's going to go.
I wrote a sermon recently for the lectionary at the end of July, and I'd never noticed this before, but in John chapter 6, between the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee, there's a single sentence that is said that Jesus sensed, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the wording in front of me. Jesus sensed that the crowd wanted to make him king, and so he retired to the wilderness. He
Oh,
did
wow.
not want to be king.
Wow. Wow. I'm gonna now that's very good.
It's a single sentence, and I've never
Yeah, but that's an important sentence. Yeah.
absolutely right. So no, so it's wrong on theological reasons. I mean, it's dead wrong on in terms of history. You got these people out there. David Barton is the main.
Yeah. Right.
He's done untold damage with this,
Right.
arguing that the founders were evangelical Christians. I mean, you and I don't have to have that conversation. I mean, it's just so ridiculous as to be laughable. But people are believing this, and people are eating it up. Another bit of evidence: the Treaty of Tripoli, and I don't
Oh,
know if you know
yeah.
this. The Treaty
Yes.
of Tripoli, right, was negotiated at the end of George Washington's administration, sent to the Senate for ratification by John Adams, read aloud before the Senate, and ratified unanimously by the U.S. Senate on, I believe, July 7th, 1797. Don't hold me to that date. I know it's 1797. But Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli says, and again, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, but Article 11 says the United States was not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. I mean, that's pretty explicit.
Right.
United States. You have
No,
the
no,
first.
it's that's like I think what the Treaty of Tripoli is like. When I have my a keynote, that is the one where I literally before I mentioned, I said, "Has anybody heard of the Treaty of Tripoli?" No
Nobody.
one.
No, that's right.
And yet, the evidence of that is that unanimously the Senate endorsed it.
It ratified it. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Yeah,
And you have the First Amendment itself. And I have to
yeah,
say, Paul, I'm worried. I've taken to saying that I wish that our current Supreme Court had half of the deference toward the First Amendment as it does to the Second Amendment.
right.
The Supreme Court is steadily whittling away at this wall of separation between church and state. And let's
Yeah,
remember where that came from. The wall of separation, that metaphor originated with Roger Williams, who's the founder of the Baptist tradition in
right.
America. You and your people are Baptists, and you know this very well. Um, I'm not saying you are Baptist today, but that's your business.
I
So,
am a
but
Baptist. I know
okay,
I'm
all right,
American Baptist.
okay, okay, all right,
That's the ordination that I enjoy
okay,
and have
all right.
served. Yeah, yeah,
I didn't realize that. Yeah, and I knew your grandfather was, but yes,
yeah.
but um, that whole thing comes from Roger Williams. He writes a treatise in 1644, and he argues for separating the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. Now, that's become so familiar that we kind of dismiss it, but let's remember the context. Roger Williams in the 17th century was not a member of the Sierra Club. That is to say, he didn't share our current romance toward wilderness.
Mm,
For him, wilderness was a place of danger where evil lurked.
mm,
And when
mm,
he talks about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, his
mm.
principal concern is to maintain the integrity of the faith,
Right.
lest
Oh,
it be
yeah.
compromised by too close an association with the state. And we miss that, and that's
Yeah.
very important. And when I talk about this, sometimes I do a follow-up, and I talk about the fact that I was one of the expert witnesses in the Alabama Ten Commandments case when
Ah.
the Chief Justice Roy Moore plopped this granite monument in the Judicial Building in Montgomery.
Mm.
And when Judge Thompson ruled correctly
Yeah.
that the Ten Commandments in that space violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment and ordered that monument removed, one of the protesters screamed, "Get your hands off my God." Now, you and I both know that one of those commandments on the side of the monument says something about graven images. And that, I think, was Roger Williams' point about protecting the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I think is so important just to underscore, and even in this conversation for our listeners, is that a lot of us who are so concerned with this, so-called separation of church and state, I would argue that the Supreme Court has done such damage to it that in effect, it's no longer, operational law. But, those of us who are arguing for these protections are not arguing it. Actually, I mean, there are some secular people who argue it, and legitimately so. But many
Sure.
of us are religious folks who actually
Absolutely.
see the danger to religion in all of this,
Absolutely.
and we are often, speaking up. I think one of the things I would love to, touch on is. The most recent book you talked about, because a lot of your books have been like look at this, this is like we have to be aware of what's happening. The book that I want to talk about is the one that you wrote about saving faith.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to reclaim the prophetic voice? How do first of all, I think I'm not sure that I said it, but I think we should underscore it. You're also a priest, an Episcopal priest. And so you come at this like legitimately from trying to find, a way that faith can still play an important role in our world. Say a little bit more about why you wrote that book and
Yeah.
then and some of the lessons for today, for those of us who continue to be within the religion space, but are looking to do it well.
Sure. Yeah, I wrote the book in part. I guess it was sort of a follow up to Bad Faith, Saving
Mm-hmm.
Faith, Bad Faith, even
Right.
though two different publishers. But um, because I was trying to look at this Christian nationalism stuff. And by the way, I don't like the term Christian nationalism. I don't think there's anything Christian about it, frankly. So, but that's what we're working with. So we'll use the phrase as it's popularly used these days, and try to understand the appeal of it. And I think I began
Uh-huh.
by saying, look, religion is in trouble in this country. I think not in terms of numbers necessarily, although that's part of it, but you have the Catholic Church, of course, with it still reeling, I think, from the pedophilia scandals, as well as from the fact that the bishops, at least many of the prominent bishops, are Trumpists these
Yeah.
days. And talk about losing prophetic voice. I think that's a pretty good example of that. Mainline Protestantism, as both you and I know, is on the skids in many ways, although the prophetic witness, I think, is still there, but it's not as robust as perhaps it once was. And then you have the evangelicals who have lost their soul, I think, to the religious right. And I'd be happy to talk more about that if you want to. And then try to understand what it is that is so attractive about this Christian nationalism. I think a big part of it is it appeals to nostalgia. And you and I both know that nostalgia is a slippery thing, and we can be nostalgic for things that never really were there. And I think that helps to explain some of the 1950s nostalgia that we hear coming out of that quarter. That is, looking for a simpler time. And I talk about how many so-called pilgrims go to Mount Airy, North Carolina, every year to, which is the kind of fictional birthplace of the Andy Griffith show, and they say talk about the values that once defined America. Well, did they ever?
And of course, like, according to who? Like, if your vantage point was as a Black American, and that religious tradition, of course, had to exercise a different kind of prophetic witness out of
Yeah.
self-preservation
Yeah.
and the protection of its people. And just wanted to note, you're putting this juxtaposition. I don't know if you saw this image that actually Donald Trump himself tweeted, which was on one side, it was like this very like picturesque, like American flag, America, as we understand Americana. And then on the other, it's like, people like, Black people and immigrants. And it was like, which future do you want? And it's like, and it was just so blatantly this nostalgia that you're talking about, leaning into it with not even implicit, explicit racial undertones or overtones. You know, I mean, but I do think that what you're talking about, this nostalgia, when everyone was okay, and it's like, yeah, the myth of nostalgia is so like rough. It feels like really, really nefarious.
It is. And then, I go on to argue that, if we are going to reclaim our prophetic voice, that is, people of faith, I think we have to come to terms with our past, and much of
Mm,
that has to do with race, and
yeah,
we've really done that. And
yeah,
this is, people, historians talk about racism as America's original sin, and I think it's a fairly good description. We haven't
yeah,
come to terms. And the fact
right.
that the religious right was born out of racism, there's no pretty way to say that, in defense of segregation. Um, I think we have to come to terms with that if we're going to reclaim our prophetic voice.
Yeah.
But also then
Eh,
finally just to look at Jesus. Now, I grew up in a tradition, I heard this, man, I'm sure a million times, right? The Word of God, the Word of God. And you have the evangelist, kind of riffling through pages of his Bible and so forth. But if you take John 1 seriously, as I do, Jesus is the Word of God, right? That's what
Uh,
John is all about. And that is to say that if we're going to reclaim our prophetic voice, we need to pay attention to Jesus in particular. Now, not to say that the rest of the Bible is negligible. I'm not saying that for a moment, but I think we need to focus on Jesus. And I'll just add an anecdote here to say that, we talked earlier, I value and I honor my evangelical upbringing, and I still cling to that in many ways, even though I, I bristle these days at being called an evangelical because I know what people mean by that. It's not what I mean by
yeah.
that, but I know what they mean by that. But when I was growing up, most of the sermons I heard, admittedly, from my father, were sermons based on the writings of Paul in the New Testament. And I want to get back to, and in my own preaching, I preach from the Gospels almost, I would say, 98% of the time,
Mm,
because that's where we find Jesus. That's where
mm,
we find the Word of God is looking at the life of Jesus.
mm,
And I think we need to get
yeah.
back to
Well, I think the headline that I'm going to tweet is Randall Balmer insists that Jesus is the only way that we can get that.
Sure. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with
You
that.
know, I mean, it's great.
Fine with that.
I think, but one of the funny, the funny things is like, there's anecdotes out of there, like, someone reading the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus, and he said, all these things, and someone saying, we need Karl Marx out of our church.
That's right. When did my pastor become a socialist?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. One of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit more was I'm just really interested in the governor of Minnesota, almost as someone who is from this mainline tradition, and is actually very kind of participates in his Lutheran faith. And what that has inspired in him. And one of the, I had a chance to talk to someone who has known them and has had benefited. Someone who's Muslim, who in Najiba Saeed, we had her on the show a couple weeks ago, and she was just talking about how the Lutheranism of the Waltzes actually inspired this great commitment to interfaith, to looking at race, to looking at immigration, to looking at the way food operates and the scarcity of food, and it was just really interesting coming from a Muslim leader who, and I think this is something that I love, and I think we need as much of it as we can, who looked at someone else's faith and said, this is really important and people shouldn't gloss over it. Like, it's really important that the role that faith has, in his personal life, also like his LGBTQ commitment. His own church is very involved in that. And so I just think I wonder if you have been following that at all as something, that ties into your hope that we might, save faith.
Yeah. Well, I like the rest of the nation, or most of the rest of the nation, I'm just now getting to know Tim Walz a little bit, and
Right.
I have to say
Me
it's a lot of
too.
fun.
Me too. Yeah.
And I'll also add that I used to live in his congressional district in rural southern Minnesota, and believe me,
Really?
it was rural. Yeah, my father was a pastor
Is that where
in
you're
East.
from? You're from Minnesota?
Well, that was one of his postings
Oh,
was
oh
rural
wow.
southern
Wow.
East
Okay.
Chain, Minnesota. East Chain, Minnesota. Let's put it this way: it's a distant suburb of Fairmont, Minnesota.
Oh
So
wow. Oh yeah. Okay.
it's,
Yeah. Which was the big city?
I mean, yes, exactly, and we lived literally surrounded by cornfields. I mean, I'm not. That's not a
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
that's not a metaphor. That was really true. So I I lived and I know that area pretty well. So I'm just kind of getting to know him as myself. But I have to say that I think it's a delightful choice, and I think learning more about his faith and the fact that it means something to him, and the fact that, as you say, uh, a Lutheran, but also a football coach, would take it upon himself to be the advisor, I think it was, to
Right.
the
Right.
LGBT um, community, trying to defend them, I think is really quite remarkable.
No, it's really amazing.
And I think
Um,
it's important. It's important that Americans understand that the faith, or Protestant faith, or Christian faith, uh, is not uh, is not synonymous with the religious right. And
Oh yeah, Interfaith Alliance. We're constantly like just reminding people the majority of religious folks actually support LGBTQ equality. The majority of religious folks actually support a reproductive right to reproductive freedom, or however that's exercised, and other issues like that. These are not outlier issues for religious folks, but the narrative has been so strongly influenced that it's Christians versus like these LGBTQ community. It's just not the truth. And this is why scholarship is so important, and then not only scholarship but figuring out ways to really impact the public understanding. So I mean that's the reason your public work has been so helpful, is that you are by any standards a great scholar, but that your scholarship kind of enters into our public awareness is what really has been helpful. And I do think this is a time when we're going to need really smart people talking about religion and democracy. And our Interfaith Alliance's tagline that we just did a kind of a brand refresh, but we have a new tagline saying achieving democracy together, because we really view religion as one of the building blocks that can be a productive, positive part of the democracy project. How do you understand religion and democracy?
oh, it's a question I don't think I've ever had before. Uh, I think religion certainly contributes to democracy, and some people have misinterpreted what I said, what I have said over the years, and including my dogged defense of the First Amendment, which I believe is America's best idea. I think the
Yeah,
First Amendment is America's best idea. In fact,
right.
I'm working on a book with that title because I think it's so important. But people have
Oh well.
misinterpreted me to say that voices of faith should not be part of our political discourse, and I couldn't disagree more strongly. I think
Right.
people have every right to bring their religious or faith commitments into the arena of public discourse. And I think public discourse will be impoverished without those voices. But what I think we also have to observe is what Jeffrey Stout calls the traditions of democracy. That is to say, that over the last 200 plus years, certain protocols have emerged as we Americans begin to understand what it means to be a democratic place, obviously a lowercase d here. And one of those traditions is that no one voice dominates
Mm,
that
mm,
arena of political
mm.
discourse. That is to say, I have every right to express my my religiously informed convictions in the arena of public discourse. But I also have an obligation to listen to others as well.
Right.
And
Right.
that is what's missing in this whole nonsense, and I'll call it that, of Christian nationalism.
Right.
They want only their voices to be expressed in the arena of public discourse or in the
Right.
laws, depending on who we're
Yeah.
talking about. But the protocols of democracy expect, if not demand, that we listen to other voices as well. And that, I think, is the richness, the texture of American life. I'm a patriot, Paul. I'm not, I don't wear red caps and I don't wave flags. But what makes me patriotic is my sense as a historian that we Americans always rise to our better selves and try to figure out ways to live into our charter documents. Now,
Mm,
we've done this far, far too slowly
yeah.
throughout our history. Certainly when we're talking about people of color, and particularly African Americans, but also with women, as you talked about earlier, LGBTQ folks. We're far too tardy in doing that, but we come around.
Yeah.
I expect, like you, I was astonished at how quickly Americans came around to the idea of same-sex marriage. I
Yeah.
mean, I never thought that would happen.
No.
It
No.
was just, it was almost instantaneous. I mean, it wasn't, of course, but
No, but it was like it was 2 decades where it just went, bloop,
right,
I mean,
right,
and
right.
unfortunately now there's like a movement to try to backslide. So there's always that. But I think one of the reasons we chose Achieving Democracy together was a reference to James Baldwin, Achieving Our Country, and the idea that, like, what is the project? The project is to achieve our country, which is the project that you're talking about, going back to our, this idea of freedom and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all, and really, like, continuing to expand what all means in that context. I want to end the way we always end in this show, which is asking folks, Randall Balmer, what gives you hope?
Mm. Well, it's a great question too. A couple of years ago, a colleague asked me to write an essay about hope, and so I did, and was reflecting on hope from the perspective of so-called theological virtues that Paul mentions at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, faith, hope, and love. And it occurred to me as I thought about it that hope is the only one of the theological virtues that is volitional. That is to say, we can choose to be hopeful. We can't choose faith necessarily, especially if you're a Calvinist. uh, uh, we don't always choose love or who we love. It comes, kind of from somewhere. But we can choose to be hopeful. It is a volitional virtue. So I think that for myself and anyone who is a parent in particular, I don't have the luxury of despair. I have to be hopeful. Now, these last few years, I have to say, Paul, and I expect maybe I'm not alone about this, it's been hard to be hopeful at various times, but I think we have to be. I think it's a necessity. So, am I hopeful? Yeah, I mean, I kind of alluded to that in my response to your last question. That is, my sense as a historian is that despite setbacks, and there have been many setbacks, despite our tardiness, we as Americans eventually rise to our better selves. And I have hope that we will continue to do so. Now, we're facing some pretty formidable challenges, I think, particularly in the next few months, that will determine whether or not we're going to make it. But I do remain hopeful.
Dr. Randall Balmer is a historian and a brilliant analyst of American religion and politics. He's the author of powerful books such as Saving Faith: How American Christianity Can Reclaim Its Prophetic Voice. Ordained in the Episcopal Church, Randall holds the John Phillips Chair in Religion at Dartmouth College. Randall, thank you so much for being with us again on The State of Belief.
Paul, it's always a pleasure. Thank you. God bless.
Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work today with a financial contribution. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of the show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at State of Belief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.